And so I had a question specifically about the podcast. I think you like clearly do a lot of research into each of those episodes. And so I'm interested, like, as you're kind of going through the process of interviewing people, how much do you try to kind of like create an overarching like story or like an arc versus just kind of like trying to ask the most interesting questions?
Yeah, it's a combination. And to be honest, like I don't have it figured out. Um, Early on, I thought a lot about creating an overarching story. Um, and then I had a couple of interviews where it was just like I realized that it's just hard to do in a conversation because you don't know how the other person's going to respond. And so you might ask a question thinking it's going to be a first in a series of 10 questions about a person's story, and they'll just like give you their entire story, and then you're out of questions. You might want the interview to go in a certain way, but they might be in a certain mood where they don't really want to talk about something, right? There's been times where I've heard someone tell a really amazing story about how they came up with their idea, and then I ask them how they came up with their idea, and they don't tell that story, or they tell like a different story. And I think as time has gone on, I've just sort of learned to give up control. Like you're not going to be able to necessarily control exactly what someone says. You can't necessarily plan out exactly what kind of story they're going to tell unless you plan it with them in advance. It just sounds unnatural, and it's not how at least my podcast works. The alternative approach is I guess you could have a super heavily edited podcast, interview somebody. Like I met a guy who interviewed, it took him 3 months to put out a 30-minute podcast episode. And this is his entire show. And the show has like millions of listeners. It's a big show. But they will literally interview dozens and dozens and dozens of people for hours each, stitch them all together and create a narrative. If you're doing that, you can create a narrative. I think for the most part nowadays, I kind of think of an episode as themes. So it's like, okay, what's interesting about this person? There might be 3 or 4 broad themes that I think are unique to their personality or unique to their story or that people should learn about. And let me come with questions around those themes. So it kind of seems like the questions are connected and not just like random scattershot questions. They're all sort of getting at kind of the same thing. Like this person is really curious, or this person's like really never gives up and keeps persisting, or this person is really into exploring lots of different ideas. And my questions will be oriented around those themes. And then I generally try to go chronologically. So my thinking for an episode is like the beginning of an episode should be really interesting. So I should just try to ask like the most interesting question and get them talking about something that people will be fascinated by. But then beyond that, like a narrative is just captivating. Like something about hearing a series of events related in chronological order that just appeals to like the human brain for whatever reason. So like I'll try to go back to the beginning of their story, which I don't think you really care about at first unless you've heard something interesting that they've done. That's why I don't start there. But after doing something interesting, we'll go to the beginning of their story and sort of ask them how they got started. And then naturally they'll end up kind of telling the story and my questions will kind of flow and hopefully we'll get somewhere. But it's not super strict. Like I've never been able to successfully have like a very detailed plan for how an episode goes and it goes that exact way.
And then have you kind of done anything specific around growth of the podcast, or that has kind of just like come through the overall Indie Hackers platform?
Yeah, it's like I started the podcast 4 months after when did I release the podcast? The podcast came out in February of 2017. Indie Hackers was August of 2016. So it was like 5 months basically after the website launched. By that time, I already had a mailing list. I already had the community going. That was a good kickstart. The early days of the podcast, like I can probably pull up a graph right now and show you what the podcast growth looks like. Give me one sec. The early days, it wasn't getting like a crazy number of downloads, but it has like steadily grown. And I haven't done anything super specific to try to grow it. Like I'm not like a strategic podcast growth guy. The best thing that I've done for the podcast is basically just be consistent. Let's see. Tell me if you can see my screen.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is the podcast growth. Every dot here is a different day. The numbers represent the number of unique downloads. You can see the very beginning, I was getting something like 500 or 600 downloads a day, and it just consistently went up. The good thing about podcasts is that people subscribe to them. So unlike like if you like start a blog, by default, no one really has to subscribe to your blog. They might read your post, might get a lot of traffic, but then they go away and you never see them again, unless you capture them on like an email list or some sort of like, social channel like Twitter where they follow you. Podcasts are generally consumed through podcast players. People subscribe. So if you put out good episodes and people like it enough to subscribe, then they'll get notified of future episodes. And so you're not only reaching new people, but you're kind of bringing along these older people. So you have like pretty good retention as far as content is concerned. Most content on the web has really bad retention. And so you can see it just kind of grows naturally without me doing anything to promote it, just because like the previous subscribers don't really churn. there's some huge dips here where it was like, oh, it's going so high, and then it stopped. Mostly that's like a result of me, not releasing episodes. So we don't see these spikes is where I was inconsistent. Or there's some places like this where there's like a little gap between these spikes, and that's because there's just like I missed an episode. And every time I miss an episode, you can see like this baseline download numbers kind of suffer. Whereas if I'm being consistent, like it happened this year, you can see the baseline download numbers like go up, and that's what matters. Like the little peaks at the top are misleading; those fluctuate depending on how popular the guest is, how good that particular episode was, how much I wanted to share on Twitter, etc. But like the baseline minimum downloads, even on off days, like watching that grow is what matters. And for me, the only thing that's been good about that has been consistency and I would say quality. Podcasting is an area where it's like you've got a lot of competition. Unless you have some sort of super niche, unique show, there's probably lots of other people who have a similar show to you. And at the end of the day, when you have a lot of competition, you generally don't grow unless you're significantly better than a lot of your competition for whatever reason. Because you probably grow through word of mouth. And people are not going to tell their friend about like the 5th best podcast that they listen to. They're going to tell them about their favorite podcast. And so for me, like I put a lot of effort into coming up with good questions, to try to having good guests. I edit my episodes to make them like flow more smoothly afterwards. A lot of people don't do that. They release a podcast and it's kind of crappy, and they're like, oh, that's good enough, and it doesn't grow because no one's recommending it because it's not that good. Even within the Indie Hackers podcast, like there are some episodes where it's like probably a good third of the episodes I'm like, that wasn't that great. And then like probably another third I'm like, that was an amazing episode, and then another third I'm just like, But like there's some outlier episodes that are like, I'm like, that was one of the best episodes I've ever done, and the growth numbers for those episodes reflect that. Like I did an episode with my friend Lynn Tai. We recorded it like sitting right here. She's one of my good friends and has been for 13 years, and people could really tell. And she had a really great story too. She's pretty much unheard of. She doesn't have a big Twitter following. She didn't share it with a ton of people. Her episode has gotten like, I think the second most number of downloads of any episode of all time. It grew like a rocket ship. It might be first now. And that's just because it was a good episode. So like podcasts grow through word of mouth. Word of mouth is fueled by quality. The only way to have quality with the podcast is to be a good host and put in the time to prepare really good episodes, in my opinion. And like, that's hard. There's no shortcut besides just like a lot of time put into it. There probably are some growth hacks, but I've talked to a lot of podcasters and we always ask each other this question, and I've never heard a satisfying answer for a good podcast growth hack.
Cool. Thanks so much.